Hello, everybody. Welcome. We're just waiting for everybody to get on the webinar. I see the numbers still kind of clicking up here, so we're going to give it just a minute. Welcome to the Tourette Association of America panel discussion. We still have people coming in, so I'm going to give it just a few more seconds here. Welcome, everybody. It looks like we have everybody in. And anyone else who joins us, it's okay if they miss this first part. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to tonight's panel discussion with the Tourette Association of America. This is a panel discussion on 504s, IEPs, and school evaluations. We'd like you to know that throughout this webinar, our panelists are going to be answering questions on this very topic: 504s, IEPs, and school evaluations. The first group of questions have been given ahead of this workshop, but we'll have time for your questions after we answer the questions that we have prepared ahead for you. At the end of this session, we will be able to answer your questions. So throughout the panel discussion, put your own questions in the Q&A that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. You can put your questions right into the Q&A, and we will answer them after we answer the questions that we have prepared ahead of this panel discussion. This panel discussion is made possible by our cooperative agreement with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC. I'd like to have our panelists introduce themselves to you before we begin our panel discussion this evening. I'm really excited to have them here, and you're all very lucky to have them and their expertise as well. So Amanda, would you like to begin and introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. My name is Amanda Coffman. I am a member of the Tourette Association's Educational Advisory Board. I have been for about 10 years. I have two kids who have Tourette, a 14-year-old and a 17-year-old, so freshman and senior in high school. So I've been where you've been. Both of my kids were diagnosed in preschool. So we've done Tourette at every educational level. My son, who's a senior, uses some assistive technology, and my daughter, who's a freshman, has a 504.
Thank you, Amanda. Dr. Hermetet?
Hi, everybody. My name is Dr. Katrina Hermetet. I am a pediatric school psychologist and the director of the Tic and Tourette service at Akron Children's Hospital. When I am not in the Tic and Tourette service, I actually lead another service called the School Success Clinic. And the School Success Clinic is for children with chronic health conditions that in the best way are educationally complicated. And so I bring to that service my national certification in school psychology, which I maintain. And prior to my training in pediatric psychology, I worked as a school psychologist in the Philadelphia school system. So happy to meet you guys and talk from that area of expertise.
Thank you. And Marissa?
Hi, everyone. I'm Marissa Smolinsky. I am a special education teacher and now department chair outside of Washington, D.C. I have Tourette's. I was diagnosed at around 12, but my parents talk about seeing tics as early as 3, and I did have a 504 in school. I have a daughter who is 6 with Tourette, who got her diagnosis in preschool. So I am in your shoes as well and navigating that to support her. And I have also had the fortunate ability to teach students in my class and on my caseload with Tourette. And I am a member of the Education Advisory Board as well as an education volunteer for the TAA.
Thank you, Marissa. And Lisa is our education coordinator here at the Tourette Association. Lisa, do you want to say hello?
Hi, everyone, and welcome. I have a high school senior that has Tourette Syndrome.
Thank you, Lisa. Lisa's going to help us with our questions and answers today and just with the logistics of the webinar. And my role here, I'm Wendy Wegman, and my role here at the Tourette Association is I am a program lead for the youth, young adult, and school education programs here at the TAA. So we will begin with our questions, which is really what you came here for. I'm going to ask our wonderful panelists the first question. How do you know that your child needs a 504 plan?
I would say, you know, if your child is experiencing a barrier in school. So there's something that is expected of them, an expectation they're not able to meet because of a feature of their Tourette syndrome. So the 504 plan is to help find ways around that barrier so that they can still gain what they need to gain from school without that standing in the way. So just the presence of tics or other symptoms doesn't do it. They have to be causing a problem with the student really accessing what's going on in school or being able to show what they know in school.
Yeah, so to piggyback off that, Section 504 sounds like part of a sentence, right? The completion of that sentence is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And that was very, very important special education, but really federal law that even the playing field for people with disabilities. And that was both in education and in the job world. And really, when we look at what it means to have a medical diagnosis that gets in the way of a child being successful, we're talking about any major life activity. So while academics may be a major life activity, socially navigating the school environment could be a major life activity. Having success in unstructured things like the cafeteria or recess can be a major life activity. So again, the language is particularly broad because again, the purpose of it is to make it fair and equal for children and adults that have medical diagnoses.
Thank you. Marissa, did you want to add anything to that?
No, you guys really covered it.
Thank you, Marissa. All right, the next question. What is the process for requesting a 504 plan?
So I know I can go in my district. One of the things you do is you have to request what we call a local screening meeting. Sometimes it's called a student support team meeting, but it is a meeting with that comprehensive committee that usually has a special education representative, a social worker, a counselor, a psychologist to review everything that is going on with your child. The school's going to come with data. You should come with information that you have, especially with stuff from your doctor about the Tourette diagnosis. And usually most of those reports from different doctors and psychologists will have recommendations for the school to say, look, this is what my child needs. This is what I would like to discuss to support him. At those meetings, you're going to get a really comprehensive discussion about your child. And the decision will then be, do we need to maybe look at special education testing, which would be to go to that IEP, or do we have enough information and really what that child needs is accommodations? Then we're going to be looking at that 504 plan.
Great. Amanda or Katrina, would you like to add anything to that?
I think that's pretty comprehensive. I mean, I would say reach out to the principal. That's where I would start is, you know, an email, a phone call to the principal to say, my child has this diagnosis. These are the things that I'm concerned about in school. Can we set up a meeting?
Great, thank you. All right.
Just to piggyback off that, what Amanda said, sometimes the principals, I found they don't always know. So if your school staff list has people in special education on that team or a psychologist, school counselor, or social worker, include all of them on that email because principals get hundreds and hundreds of emails and don't always know this law the way that special education, psych, and social work counselor staff do.
Great, thank you. Next question. What 504 accommodations do you recommend for children with tics?
So that's a really hard question because there are no two children with tics that experience the same barriers or need the same accommodations to get around those barriers. So rather than thinking about my child has tics, what accommodations do they need? It's my child is struggling with this. How do we get around that? You know, because it could be things as different as, you know, if you've got a lot of head and neck tics and you're really having difficulty following along with reading, maybe you need, audio or text to speech. Whereas if you're, having a lot of tics that involve your arms or hands, then it might be writing and that output that is more difficult. It might be environmental. My child is really struggling in the cafeteria. Or my child is really struggling in science class and nowhere else. So it's really trying to figure out what is the problem we're trying to fix before we can think about what are the accommodations the child might need to address that problem.
Yeah, and this is where I find the iceberg to be particularly powerful, especially for educators that may think they know everything about tic disorder, Tourette syndrome, but they need also some education, right? Because often you need those pieces of the iceberg under the water to be as supported as the tics that are above the water. Another thing that's very important to think about is, tics often do not occur in isolation. We're often thinking about those comorbidities. And for some of our kiddos, sometimes the comorbidities are what really shows up at school. So our inattentive behaviors, our anxiety, our OCD. So making sure that we're looking at the child holistically. And also when you get that 504, making sure that 504 fits your child, right? That it isn't a boilerplate 504 for another kid with Tourette syndrome in the district. It's really kind of capitalizing on your child's strengths and their unique comorbidities and unique profile that's related to them as a student.
Wonderful. Marissa, did you want to add anything to that?
No, that was super comprehensive.
Okay, great. So here's another question. What accommodations would be appropriate for co-occurring conditions like anxiety, OCD, and ADHD?
I'm going to say same answer.
Yeah.
What is the problem that's being caused by these particular things? My daughter has ADHD, and the accommodation everybody wants to give is that she can leave the classroom when she feels overwhelmed and go down to the counselor's office. She's never in her life going to leave the classroom or admit that she's overwhelmed, to be perfectly honest. So having that written in a 504 is useless. I always think of her 504 as being the things that are most important. And so I don't want anything in there that the teacher's going to remember and focus on that isn't going to be helpful. So it's what does my child need to be able to deal with their anxiety? What does my child need to be able to deal with their ADHD? And that's going to depend on your child and what problems those underlying conditions are causing and what solutions your child is willing to implement for them.
Yeah, I think one maybe diagnostic sequela of OCD, anxiety, ADHD, and tic that is all shared is difficulty with executive functioning. And if you think about executive functioning, we really need that on fleek to be successful in school, right? So executive functioning, I like to think of it as like the conductor of the orchestra of your brain. And so it's responsible for organization of materials or even organization of our words, working memory, processing speed, emotional control. And so some of the best 504 accommodation plans I've seen are not so tic or diagnostic specific. They're really executive functioning specific because that's kind of hallmark of all four of those diagnoses.
And I would just to add, when I've worked with hesitant teachers before, an easy place to start is that extended time. Because when looking at that bottom of the iceberg, when you take away that time constraint from a kid who has ADHD, anxiety, tic, Tourette, you're going to help reduce a lot of that below the iceberg because that timer is gone. And so if this is all too vague because we're saying really focus on your child is individual, and you really need that tangible place to start because that's where your school is, and every school is on a different journey with where they are in understanding tics and Tourette. Starting with that extra time is a really good place to start that conversation.
Thank you all very much. Next question is, why would my child or teen need an IEP instead of a 504 plan?
Golly, that is probably the most question heard around the world for anyone that works in special education, right? And what I hear in that question is really, what is the core difference between an IEP and a 504? And so if I could boil it down to one sentence, and Amanda, Marissa, feel free to jump in. A Section 504, again, think about where it's coming from in the history of the law. It's an accommodation plan, right? An IEP can include accommodations, right? So it can look very much like a Section 504, but in addition to that, there has to be demonstrable evidence that that child's diagnosis, whether that's Tourette syndrome or dyslexia, is getting in the way of them being academically successful, right? So there needs to be that academic evidence. And with that academic evidence, as evidenced in the ETR, there are going to be academic goals with accompanying service time in that IEP. So again, to summarize, the core difference between a Section 504 and an IEP is where their birthplace is in the history of law. And the fact that a Section 504 has accommodations only, and an IEP has both accommodations and intervention service time associated with the highlighted academic area of need.
I think that's a great way to put it,
Yeah.
Katrina. Like, it's that specially designed instruction. So I think of it as input and output. If my child is just having a problem with output, they need accommodations to be able to show what they know and do what is expected of them. But if they're having trouble with input, if they're having trouble learning the material in school and they need that material to be presented to them in a different way, then that's specially designed instruction, and that's an IEP. So you do not need to be struggling academically to qualify for a 504. You can have accommodations without having academic struggles, but you really do need to have academic challenges that are going to be addressed through an IEP.
And to pivot off that also, because we do have those 2E kids, those twice exceptional kids who I know that struggle to get them that IEP or 504 can be so much harder. Really where there you're going to look at that educational impact is not going to necessarily be with those core academic subjects. It's going to be with that executive functioning piece. Because especially as they get older, if their teacher is doing all their executive functioning and has everything laid out, and they're coming home and you're laying everything out, that's great that they have all that support. But that's where they're missing that academic piece, and they need to be taught explicitly how to do those things.
Wow, this is so good. Thank you both so much, all of you. You're answering some of the questions in the that came in already too from the attendees. The next question is a follow-up to the IEP question. Why would somebody need an IEP instead of a 504? The next question is, what services would be appropriate in the IEP and why? And again, of course, we know this is variable depending on the individual, but you've all done just such a great job. So what services would be appropriate in an IEP and why?
So I think, again, it goes back to what does that child need and where those child's documented deficits are and where they need that specially designed instruction. So you're going to look at what goals does the child have, and then how can we get those goals met so that they can, essentially, the goal is always to lose the IEP and no longer qualify for special education services. So what do they need to meet that goal and either then be dismissed or continue on to the next level of support within that? So whether that is pull-out time because they really need that in a smaller group structured setting, or it's being pushed in with that special education support in that general education setting, or maybe it's a combination of both. A lot of times, most likely, it will be with a special education teacher or special education staff, because while I know that, private OTs and private SLPs, they do a lot of that executive functioning. When you're looking at school-based OT and speech, it's really on accessing that educational environment. So they don't do those executive functioning pieces and those sensory pieces the same way that private OTs and SLPs and PTs do. That really is what the special education teacher would be working on to support your child.
I would say the only inappropriate service in an IEP is if tic reduction is a goal. Tic reduction should not be the goal of the IEP. That is not within the student's control. and it is not going to move their educational program forward. So if you find that your school team is really focusing on the tics and the frequency and the severity of the tics, then that's a place to sort of, put on the brakes and say, but the tics might be an indicator of how other things are going. And so what are the other things that are going to affect the tics rather than working on the tics to affect the rest of the educational environment?
I think relatedly, and this will probably come up later, it's very important for families to know about what's called the Big 13. So the Big 13 are the eligibility categories as outlined for IDEA in an IEP, right? So kids can qualify under 13 different categories. And within that 13, there's something called other health impairment. And in other health impairment, both Tourette disorder and ADHD are actually spelled out in its definition, right? Diagnoses that we're kind of talking about today that are not in the Big 13 are diagnoses like anxiety, diagnoses like OCD. Even if you have gotten a prior diagnosis of executive functioning disorder or auditory processing disorder, while your children may be experiencing some deficits associated with that diagnosis is not part of the Big 13 category. And so that is something I always tell families, because I don't want families to be at odds with the school when the school is coming back and saying, yes, we understand that your child has profound OCD. We're going to be able to accommodate that, but that doesn't fit into the Big 13. So what I would encourage parents to say is something like, my child has a diagnosis of Tourette syndrome. Tourette syndrome impacts their ability to executively function. And in addition to that, they have difficulties in writing. And so these are the accommodations that I'm looking for, the service time that I'm looking for.
Great. Thank you. The next question is, why would my child need a school or psychological evaluation? So I think I'll start with that one. Why would my child need a school or psychological evaluation?
A couple of different reasons, possibly. Thinking school evaluations, they're going to have a school evaluation to qualify for an IEP. The school has to determine that they are eligible on what we call a two-pronged definition, that they have a qualifying disability that fits in one of those 13 categories, and that they require specially designed instruction. So the evaluation is looking for what are our goals going to be, essentially. What do we need to work on with this student? What services do we need to provide so that they can access their free appropriate public education? That's what your IEP is about. So they have to do an evaluation to know those things. So that's sort of bottom line, the number one reason. A big concern for parents is your kid is struggling, and now they tell you we're going to go into this evaluation period and it's going to be 60 school days, and that can take an entire semester by the time you get permission signed and you get meetings held and you get things in place. And that period of time can be frustrating. It can be frustrating for parents and for students and for teachers, but it's necessary. We can't just be guessing at what the student needs. So that evaluation is going to help with that.
Yeah, and in a lot of the districts I work with in Ohio, so we call that what's called a psychoeducational evaluation. That kind of sounds like the question, right? So we're both looking at educational factors, but then we're also looking at, I would call it broadband psychological factors. So things like attention, memory, mood, other medical or mental health diagnoses that would impact our daily functioning. So I'm guessing that's kind of what you're alluding to, right? An MFE or an ETR, MFE stands for multi-factored evaluation. And what that really means is that we wouldn't really solely take one educational expert's, take on your student or your child, right? There's going to probably be an occupational therapist that's going to be looking at things, a speech and language therapist. They're going to be looking at behavioral observation. If it's a really good MFA or really good ETR, they might even be doing peer comparisons. So looking at your child in the classroom, but also looking at other children in the classroom to see if your child's kind of paying attention similarly to the other kids in his classroom, right? So these are often substantial documents. And that really is the reason why Amanda kind of said that they take 60 days, because it's multiple parties really putting in their input, including you as parent, as interviewer, and teachers, to make this kind of multi-dimensional document to make sure they got the student correct.
Yeah, I got nothing to add.
Okay, all right, thanks. This question goes along with that question. What other evaluations besides the psychological evaluation should or could be requested, and why would you request them?
So an educational evaluation should also always be included in that big group of assessments, and that would be using a standardized educational test that is norm referenced. So that is comparing your child academically in lots of different areas to how other children throughout the country in their age range perform. And that's going to give you a really good example, because it's not only looking at what your teacher is saying and on teacher-made assessments or whatever state end of year assessment that you guys have. This is looking at the nitty-gritty and comparing your child to students throughout the country. And then the other piece that I think is really important is that sociocultural interview. In my district, it's done with the social worker, but it gets that social history and medical history, not only for your child, but for the family. And that is the parent's most involved aspect, because that's that parent interview. And it's going to give your time to share and have formally documented all of that medical history and all of your concerns and what things are like for your child at home, and those struggles that you probably have been noticing since preschool, that most likely they are not at the same school they were at for preschool. And so really gives that in-depth information. And as obviously that psychological as well. And then depending on the needs, maybe those occupational therapy evaluations, SLP, PT, adapted PE, if that is something that your child might need. The other piece is, if you don't feel your school district is doing a good job with that evaluation after the results come in, written into that IDEA law is that you have the right as a parent to request an independent educational evaluation. So yes, this would prolong this longer, but especially in those districts where schools do and teams do not want to see those kids with Tourette get an IEP because of all their reasons that don't make sense in my mind, but I've heard them and they're there. This way you can get that outside opinion that usually comes back and says, here's the deal. And even if you just bring it up, a lot of districts don't want to pay for them. So just bringing it up and saying that you're aware of this option might move things along in a different direction as well.
I would say, though, do not expect to just come in with your outside evaluation and have them accept that and move on. They
Agreed.
are required to do their own and to meet their own standards. So they have to consider any of the outside information. A lot of times they'll, be grateful to have it, but it's not as easy as, well, I can go private pay. So if I private pay for this evaluation, then I can walk in and get the IEP sooner. It doesn't work that way.
There are also a lot of schools on the East Coast that do what's called RTI, or response to intervention, and that's something else to be aware of. So response to intervention was really kind of an educational theory that if we continue to screen kids throughout our school, we can really put them in a tiered model of risk, right? So the bottom of that triangle are kind of our general population. They don't require any specialized intervention. The middle of that triangle is kind of that at-risk group that we want to really keep good eyes on. And then that top of the triangle are kids that require more individualized education, right? So some districts really are wedded in that RTI model where they're constantly evaluating kids. They're doing weekly, what we call CVM, or curriculum-based measures, to catch kids before they fail. And so that's something just to be familiar with, especially with some of our East Coast, and it's in some of our Midwest districts too, that your district might be doing testing, and that testing might seem like a long time before that IEP process, but that might be because they're going through the RTI process. Very important too, because I keep kind of hearing this theme of psychological, right? The most traditional way to really diagnose a learning disability is to evaluate the child's IQ and then evaluate their core academic areas. So if their IQ is, let's say their IQ is 100, that's the mean IQ, right? 100 is very solidly in the average range. We would expect that their reading, their writing, and their math should also kind of cluster within 15 points around that 100, right? If their math is a 70, right, and their IQ is a 100, that's a discrepancy, right? And so that's considered what's called the traditional discrepancy model of special education, that our IQ cannot predict how we're going to do academically. And so as a parent, that might be scary. It might be like, man, they're doing a psychological evaluation. What does that mean? A lot of times that language is used to describe the cognitive piece of an ETR that they're doing, looking at that IQ.
That's a great point. Sometimes I think those terms, psychological evaluation, is intimidating. So thank you for pointing that out. The last question before we go on to the many questions in our Q&A panel, and keep putting them in the Q&A panel, please, is what is the process for requesting a school evaluation?
So I think we sort of discussed this already, but it would be to have that initial email or contact with the school saying that, just like with a 504, the process starts the same. You want to have a conversation about how you could possibly get additional services for your child.
And always recall that schools run on dates, right? So meaning that if you run into your principal at the grocery store, or you talk to the teacher after school, in the eyes of special education law, that conversation did not happen. And so what I would recommend is, if you run into your principal at the grocery store, follow up maybe that next day, even with a written note that says, hey, great running into you at Acme, put the date on there. As we discussed in the fruit aisle, I'm really worried about Tommy's educational functioning. So just take what you said and kind of that unstructured interaction, put a date and a timestamp on it, because that date becomes that 90-day timeline we discussed. That date becomes how we're going to be held accountable as the district to make sure that we're following up with your child's educational needs and your date of written request.
And the timeline doesn't start until you have signed permission to evaluate. So when that gets sent home to you or emailed to you, or however your district does that, you want to turn that around real quick. That starts the clock on the evaluation. They can't do anything without your written permission to do so.
Thank you. This is actually, I am going to add one question, because this is one that comes up a lot for us here at the Tourette Association. If I request a school evaluation, does the school have to automatically evaluate my child?
So the school does not. That's why it is so important to come with all of your own data and your own information as well to the meeting. The school's going to come with what they have, and you need to still prove the educational impact. And a lot of times, especially for those higher functioning kiddos who, as we've mentioned, are making the grades because they're spending 10 times more at home and energy at home doing it, and then they're falling apart. Well, that is having an educational impact on them. No one should be coming home and doing 10 hours, I know that's an exaggeration, of homework, or spending all day using all of their energy that they fall apart the moment they're not there. And so the school team doesn't have all that information. So that's that piece that's so important for you guys to bring to those meetings, because you are that advocate for your child, and you're able to say, I understand that he's presenting or she's presenting this way at school, but this is the data I have to support that this is not working and there is an educational impact, because we are going home every day and it's taking 10 hours to do homework, and we're having 5 meltdowns, and we're having a hard time getting to school because of all of these things. And usually as that conversation unfolds, the school team will start to notice different things and pick up, oh, I do have to remind so-and-so 10 times to take their pencil out. and things like that. But if you don't come with that information to be prepared, they might not have all of the insight on your child for that initial meeting, and then might say, at this point, we do not feel that there's an educational impact, and therefore we are not going to proceed with additional testing.
Also relatedly, if they deny you, which again is absolutely within their right, you have the right to ask for that in writing. And so that is called a prior written notice. So prior written notice is the written reason why they did not pursue the ETR 504 process. And oftentimes districts might say, you know, I see a lot of prior written notice like, hey, we see your request, parent. We've already started that process. Sorry for not informing you. Or, you know, hey, yeah, we see that process, but they just got all A's last quarter. So what are you talking about, right? So by them putting it in writing and putting it in that prior written notice, that gives you the ability and the opportunity to follow up and say, hey, just like Marissa said, I know they're getting A's right now, but here's what you don't see at home, right? It just protects everybody. So make sure if the school says no, to ask for that prior written notice so you can see their rationale why in writing.
Mm-hmm. You will also have schools who say, thanks for bringing this to our attention. Here are the things that we can do, you know, through that response to intervention process, or sometimes they call it the, you know, MTSS, multi-tiered system of supports. You know, we can put your child into a level 2 reading support to help out with this. And they want to say, let's do that instead of evaluating. You can come back and say, I think that that's wonderful. What's the reason to delay the evaluation while we do this? Can we do those two things at the same time? Because otherwise you're collecting 6 weeks of data on whether or not this, you know, support worked. And if the support worked, does that mean the child doesn't need the support? No, it means that they do need the support. So that is almost an indication that perhaps there are other things that we need to gather information about. So, you know, in an effort to be responsive sometimes, you know, schools will offer something that sounds great, but if you've reached the point where you really feel like your child needs an evaluation to figure out what's going on, it's okay to push back and say, can we start the evaluation at the same time that we're starting these other interventions?
Yeah, in Ohio, they actually have that coded into law, right? That RTI cannot be used to delay the ETR and MFE process. It's supposed to be preventative in its approach, right? Catch kids that are at risk before they end up in more clinical levels of academic need, right? So if you feel like your district has your child in RTI purgatory, or they've been stuck in tier 2 forever, or they're saying like what Amanda said, saying they're getting intervention, make sure to push back and follow up and really look at your state laws kind of guidelines with the way that RTI is supposed to be used, because RTI, that was never the spirit of it. The spirit of it was to catch kids before they fall. But a lot of times, yeah, districts will stick kids in there forever and ever.
Wonderful. Thank you for all these great answers to these questions. And we have many more. Some of them have been answered that people put in the question and answer, and some of them I'm trying to kind of morph together because people are asking similar things. I want our attendees to know you can continue in the question and answer. We won't get to all of them. However, we will follow up with an email, and we will try to answer the questions, since a lot of them have similarities. In a follow-up email, we have all of our attendees' email addresses. In the chat, you don't have access to chat with other people in the chat as an attendee, but we have put a few resources in there. Please know these resources are available to you, as well as school presentations here at the TAA and support for school. You can reach out to support@tourette.org and programs at tourette.org if you're interested in a presentation for your school. So with that in mind, one of the first kind of little section of questions that I got when this panel discussion began is a question about, you know, being in your senior year and having a 504 and preparing for college. So is there anything in particular that you can recommend for senior year, and anything particular you can recommend? And again, I know it varies for everybody, but these were just some of the questions as students with tic disorders and Tourette syndrome prepare for college.
I'm right there, preparing for college. I've got a senior with a tic disorder. He does not have a 504, but he does use assistive technology. So his handwriting is atrocious. He uses an iPad to take all of his notes because it will convert his handwriting into actual text that other people can use. So I will tell you, without a 504, we were able to get accommodations on the AP test. He was able to type his answers. So, you know, those things as you hit high school, you need to start working with your counselors early, just to make sure that all of those things are in place. We had to come up with the original documentation of his dysgraphia diagnosis from when he was 6. So, you know, make sure you kind of have all of those ducks in a row as well. His 504 will not follow him to college. However, he knows that when he arrives on campus, it's his responsibility to seek out the disability services office. So, you know, listen real carefully to how I said that. When he arrives on campus, it is his responsibility. He will turn 18 in May. The college will not talk to me. They don't want to hear from me. They don't care what I have to say. So the other thing to be working on in your senior year is those self-advocacy skills, having your student recognize what is it that they actually need. Is it separate setting for tests? Do they need extended time? Colleges and a college board and those kinds of places get real tricky about extended time. They've seen it too often as the sort of catch-all to help everybody do better. So if your student needs extended time and has been receiving it all through high school, make sure you have documentation of that specifically. Like they receive 50% extended time on exams, or, you know, he is allowed to use his assistive technology to type anything longer than a paragraph. Like it needs to be very specific and set to the actual needs. And then they'll just need to work with that Office of Disability Services. All colleges and universities have them, to figure out how to work with their professors to get the things that they actually need.
Just to piggyback on that, while I don't have a senior yet, my oldest is 6, so I am a long way away. You know, around 20, a little over 20 years ago, that was me transitioning from high school to college with Tourette. And I knew my accommodations and I knew what accommodations I needed. You know, this was also a long time ago. It was big news. Like right after I took the SATs, they got rid of the little extra time asterisk, who I don't know if any of the parents remember that little extra time asterisk. But it used to be if you had that accommodation on the SAT, your scores were sent with that caveat of everyone knowing you had extra time. So it was a huge win for disability rights when that asterisk got taken away. But that also meant you had to defend more why you needed it, because people didn't see that you had it. But really knowing what accommodations you need and having your child be able to verbalize or in written form express how important they are for them to have. Because if they can't do that, they're not going to be able to get them in college. If your child is still looking at colleges, during your tour, go to the disabilities office and set up a meeting with them, try to get to know them. Because if your child's not comfortable at the disability office because they get a bad vibe, they're not going to go, and that's not going to support them either.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I would speak to, just as a college professor myself, if you are teaching your child to be a good advocate, you want them having that discussion with the Office of Access, maybe even before they start their first day. I think it's the most frustrating experience for everybody that our college student waits to fail or waits before the night before a test to then go running to the Office of Access and so say, oh, hey, by the way, I have Tourette syndrome, right? When I talk to my college students that I work with, I talk about like, that's not advocating for yourself, but that's also impacting our community, our TS community, right? Because they, you know, whether they love it or not, have a responsibility, not just to advocate for themselves as college students, but other students behind them with Tourette syndrome. If your child has an IEP, starting in as early as 8th grade, I think in Ohio, they have transitioning planning baked into that IEP. And so that is supposed to be on the table, active dialogue towards the end of middle school here, that we have specific transitional goals. And even in my time, that has dropped down. It used to be more like 9th grade, 10th grade, we'd start talking about transition. And we realized as an educational curriculum, that was getting too late. We really needed to have transition conversations with our middle school students to get them prepared to be, like Amanda and Marissa said, an independent advocate, because it really is going to come on them, because us as parents, we can't call the, Ohio State and say, hey, like my child needed these accommodations. What happened? You can't do that after they turn 18.
Mm-hmm. And, in high school, I've been big on advocate with the teacher, like show the teacher your iPad, explain to her how you're using this in math, why she wants you to scan all of your tests and do it this way, because she'll never know what your answers were otherwise. Advocate with the teacher. In college, it is go to the Office of Disability Services. Like, yes, you want to have a relationship with your professors where you can go to them, but it's a bigger pond, and working out individual things with each professor is not going to work. You need that Office of Disability Services to really be able to say, oh, this is how we do testing in a separate location here. This is how we accommodate this, because your child won't be the first, young adult with Tourette syndrome that the Office of Disability Services will have seen.
Great, thank you for that. I have a few people asking about the 3-year review for a 504 and how to prepare for that, if you have any advice in preparing for that 3-year review.
3-year review for a 504 or for an IEP?
It says that they have a 3-year review coming up for their 504 plan.
Because your 504 should be reviewed every year to make sure that the accommodations are still appropriate. But there's not a 3-year reevaluation like there is for an IEP. The person, individual, because a 504 can cover adults as well, has a diagnosed disability and requires these accommodations. Your annual review is, are these still the correct accommodations? You should not have to prove every 3 years that you still have a disability.
Thank you. So perhaps what is happening is that there might be a 3-year review for their evaluations, and they don't necessarily need to prepare for that, but their 504 should be reviewed every year. And I do know their IEP should be reviewed every year. And can you speak a little bit to if there is some kind of an issue with maybe the family is sensing that the IEP isn't being followed or the 504 isn't being followed, what families can do in terms of if that's in between those meetings that would happen annually?
You can always request a meeting whenever you want as a parent. So if you don't feel that the IEP or 504 is working, reach out to whoever your child's case manager is and say you want to convene a meeting. We have 30 days to make that happen. So, and if they don't respond back to you pretty soon, loop in their supervisor. Those meetings have to happen. It is your legal right to request them, and they have to do them within 30 days. And if you don't feel that the hours are being supported or they're not getting the support, ask for the data.
Yeah. And email is your friend, because that's going to have a time and date stamp on everything you've sent. I sent you an email requesting a meeting on this date, at this date and time. I did not receive a response back. This is my second follow-up, looping in your supervisor.
Yeah, and in special education language, a lot of times when we describe these, and I've heard Marissa use this term before too, as living documents, right? That means that really at any time they can be reviewed. So if your school is either directly or non-directly communicating, hey, we're not going to touch that, IEP, it's not time yet, or it's not the 3-year reeval, we'll look at it again. They're kind of out of compliance. So you might have to become kind of confident and familiar with that language of reminding the school that this is a living document. And so I would like to review it, right? A lot of times too, something that I don't love to see is I don't love when schools use a Section 504 as a consolation prize or the silver medal, right? These are 2 different students with 2 different areas of need. And so we don't give a Section 504 because the child did not earn an IEP, right? They're different documents. They're from different areas of the law, but they should be reviewed similarly, right? Sometimes I get concerned, especially with Section 504s, that they're not seen as living documents. And so it gets filed away somewhere. And then we don't even remember that that child has a Section 504 until we have an issue, right? So as a parent, something I might do is I might just put an annual reminder in there. So maybe every May you put a reminder in your iPhone. Okay, I'm going to email the director of special ed to see if I can get a meeting on the books before the end of the year to revisit that 504. So again, this stuff is tough, because you have to be your child's best advocate. So you model the way for them to advocate for themselves.
And it wouldn't be uncalled for, especially with those 504s, IEPs as well, to sort of request it in April, May, towards the end of the year. I'm on the East Coast, so we go to mid-June, sometimes end of June, but then ask for it again pretty early on in the school year. So you have that end of the year to do what worked that year and make sure that's in place for whatever state testing there is and to start the year off strong. But new teachers and different personalities and different class dynamics might change the accommodations that your child needs. And so therefore, in like October, meeting again to say, okay, this has been working so far this year. This has not. We need to rethink this to have a full year of success.
When I was a special education teacher and I would have those renewals that were on the cusp, it's like the last week of school or the first week of school that the dates were going to end up coming due. I would set that meeting in May, because we got out in May, so the end of April or the beginning of May. And at the meeting with the parent and I would schedule an IEP for the end of September, beginning of October. Then I already had the invitation set and in our computer system and ready to go, and just had to inform next year's teacher of this, kind of thing. Because when you're set to meet in October, November anyway, usually things are going pretty well, and that serves your child through the end of the year. And you want to gather a little data on the next year anyway. But when you're running up right against the end of the school year, or the beginning of the school year, you don't want to have to do that IEP the first week of school and that teacher still can't remember your child's name 100% of the time. It helps to sort of push it back to the spring to be in compliance, and then set up the meeting a few weeks, usually I would say 3 or 4 weeks into school, when the new teacher sort of has a handle on your child as well.
Great, thank you. Before I ask the next question, I want to say we did have a couple questions about students with coprolalia, and Lisa put a panel discussion that we just did with some of the advisory board in the chat panel. So that is in the chat. There is a link to that. I just want to say that no, your child shouldn't be punished for coprolalia, right? They shouldn't be suspended, punished. So for sure that is true. And you can reach out. I put it in here, support@tourette.org, if you need some more support with that particular topic. And also I'm seeing some questions around having some difficulty, needing some advice in particular with your child's IEP, if they're out of compliance, what else to ask for. And I put a link to parent training information centers around the country. And a lot of times these parent centers have advocates that can sit down with you and help you look over your IEP or your 504 plan and really go through what might be working and what isn't. So I just wanted everyone to have access to that. We do have time for a couple more questions. I am going to put up a slide with a survey. It has a QR code. If you're an attendee and you would be so kind as to just use your phone and go onto this QR code while you listen to our amazing panelists answer a couple last questions, we would super appreciate it. Like I said before, we are funded by the CDC in order to bring these wonderful panels to you, these panel discussions and other programs. This is an opportunity for you to let us know how we did on this panel, but also to let us know what kind of future programming you would need. And it could be something as simple as just needing more information, on this particular topic. So please take the time to do that. I'm going to share the screen while I ask the next question. This one is one that I think a lot of people do wonder that have children with Tourette. Is it appropriate to put accommodations for like a 504 or an IEP for homework, and particularly for homework? Are those accommodations appropriate, and are they appropriate across like grade levels from kindergarten through 12th grade?
So if a child needs reduced assignments, then that should be included in homework. If they need the extra time, depending on why they need the extra time, that should be included in homework. If they need it at school, they need it at home. If they don't need it at school, I would say in this case, they wouldn't need it at home.
I would agree. I think that's the best way to put that. Homework is part of your child's educational program. So if we're modifying the child's educational program to meet their needs, then it's definitely appropriate for modification. But again, if they're able to keep up with the workload at school and you're not modifying anything there, then you really need to have a reason why you would be modifying it at home. And it may be that their ability to do homework is very different from their ability to do schoolwork after they've, stuck through with school the whole day long. But I would want to know, are there other accommodations we should be making at school then as well, so that they've got something in the tank by the time they get home? Are we looking at the whole educational program from, the time they enter the school building until the homework is done in the evening? That's their educational program.
Yeah, some of the best accommodations I've seen have not actually been reducing homework, but modifying schedules. Like Amanda said, if we know that our kids are being cognitively fatigued by the end of the day, just from doing tic control, trying to keep their ADHD in control, then maybe we look at their schedule holistically and say, okay, maybe we put the heavy hitter of chemistry in the beginning of the morning and kind of taper off in the afternoon. Or maybe if homework is so challenging, we don't take that expectation away from them, but maybe we have a co-taught study hall right in the morning where we're working with our educational specialists and we're completing homework from the night before, right? So again, really using that schedule and looking at your child, just like Amanda said, sun up to sundown, to see if there's something we can even do within the school day. And I hate to start a rumor, but I know just from being in the school success clinic, actually, a lot of schools around here locally have really been starting to look very critically at homework. And a lot of schools are actually coming up with a minimal or no homework policy, which is a really, really significant change from when all of us were at school. So
I was also, to add on that, I work in a very large school district in this country, and in the top 15. And we, for the most part, at the elementary level, have a no homework policy, because the research that our district has reviewed has said that besides reading at home for 15 to 30 minutes a night, at the elementary level, homework does not do any additional service to a child. Mm-hmm. That does change for middle school and high school when, doing some more math problems really is beneficial to your learning.
Yeah, so those secondary grades, where homework is meant to be preparing you for class. Yeah, if they're reading a novel in English, you still have to read that novel in English, but perhaps you can do it with, a audiobook instead of only the text in front of you. Generally, those things should be done together. But or, you know, just having somebody break down, I'm supposed to read 4 chapters this week, but I have, you know, basketball Monday and Wednesday. So when am I going to be able to put the time in? Those time management, executive functioning skills. I always say the one thing that I can't change for a kid is I can't change algebra. Like algebra is algebra, and these are the things that you have to learn. So what is the appropriate modification? Probably not no algebra homework, but is it, you know, do the last 5 problems where you're just doing the application of the skill rather than, you know, solving the 10 equations before that, those kinds of things. So modifications to homework are definitely always on the table, but you want to think about what's really going to benefit your child the most in how you modify it. You don't want to leave them unprepared for the learning that they're going to need to do in class.
Great. Thank you all so very much. I'm just doing one last quick call for this QR code. If you haven't used it yet, we will send a link and a follow-up email, but we super appreciate you doing these evaluations. Our future program actually really does depend on it, on hearing from you. So thank you so much for doing that. I'm going to stop sharing that and just let you know a few things that can be helpful. I know there's a lot of questions in the chat. When we send our follow-up email, we do have a previous webinar that Marissa and Dr. Hermetet did on 504's IEPs. We do have another recording and specifically on outside evaluations and in-school evaluations. We'll be sure that we send all these resources to you. I did see some questions about explaining symptoms to your school, and I did put in the chat, reach out to programs@tourette.org. I know you all, everybody attending has my email because your link to this webinar came from my email. Please reach out to me. We can arrange really an in-service with your school. We have online video resources. We have virtual presentations. We have people that can come into schools and do presentations, professional development on Tourette and co-occurring conditions. So know that that exists. We also have a program where we have youth that are trained to come into schools and give presentations on Tourette to students. So that's a super valuable resource that really helps do away with the stigma and any type of bullying that kids are potentially facing or you worry that they may face. You can reach out to me or support@tourette.org for these resources. I did see some questions about self-advocacy. So your children can also train to be what we call junior youth ambassadors, and as young adults, rising leaders. And these programs teach self-advocacy and advocacy for other skills. And they range in age from age 7 all the way to 25. So please, if you're interested in that, please reach out. We can give you more information. There are a few other resources in the chat tonight, but mostly I'd like to really thank our panelists for this really incredibly informative panel discussion. You are truly experts, and I know everybody attending has really appreciated receiving this information. We're truly fortunate to have you here at the Tourette Association, working with us the way that all of you do. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for attending this panel discussion and for your interest. And we do have all of your questions saved, so believe me, we are going to comb through them, kind of combine things if there's any overarching themes, send resources, but also know that if you still have burning questions and they haven't been answered and they're not answered in that follow-up email that we'll send to you, please reach out to us. We can help you. It's what we do here at the TAA. We support you at school, and we have a big team of education advisory board members, and we also have a big team of education volunteers that are trained to support you as well throughout the country. So again, that you can reach out to me or support@tourette.org. And thank you so much for being on this evening. I know we went a few minutes over. And thank you again to our panelists. Everybody have a wonderful evening.